Hey everyone, thanks for joining. So I'm going to try give you a quick guide to APIs, so straight from the ground up to where you can start accessing APIs. A bit about me. My name's Ryan Edwards, so I'm a Kiwi, so I'm from New Zealand, and originally I did a Bachelor of Commerce and a Bachelor of Science at the University of Auckland. So for commerce, I majored in accounting and finance, and for science, I majored in computer science. So while I was studying and a bit towards the end of my degree, I've worked in the retail industry in New Zealand, specifically the supermarket industry for a company called Foodstuffs. So Foodstuffs is what Coles and Woolies are here. Woolies in New Zealand is actually the owner of Countdown, which is the two main supermarket chains in New Zealand, that being Foodstuffs and Countdown. I also worked in the high-tech industry in Shenzhen, so that was a strategic marketing management consultancy type role. And yes, Shenzhen's just above Hong Kong, quite an exciting area. So that's sort of a bit about me before joining the data school. Since joining, I've worked on quite a few exciting projects. Some of the ones that really come to mind and stand out was a predictive model for an ASX 200 client. So that was quite an exciting way of looking at how to optimize livestock growing up for meat production. So it was quite a interesting piece of work to work on, and we managed to get that model quite accurate by the end of it. Some of the other projects, I've been quite heavily involved in the education sector, and something which I was quite passionate about was working on a way of identifying at-risk students. So currently in the education sector, a lot of analytics is in the reactive space. It's about seeing what has happened. A student has not shown up to school, whereas we wanted to get to the more proactive and predictive area. So that would be, we're noticing a decline in student attendance. What's going on with the student? Are we able to intervene? Are we able to help the student out before it gets worse? So that was quite an exciting and quite a passionate sort of area of work. And a good segue into this topic is I had a huge piece of work with relating to the Google geocoding APIs. So I actually use those APIs not just for the geocoding component, but also as a way of address verification. So Google's quite smart. If you send them an address with the wrong postcode, they'll correct the postcode. So if I sent them a list of addresses and some of those postcodes were wrong, I could then match the original postcode to the one Google has geocoded. And by doing that for every field in the address, not just postcodes, but also suburbs, I would be able to quite quickly compile a list of slight mismatches, typos, that sort of thing. And so that actually improved the overall accuracy and verification for addresses across the organization. The other aspects of the Google geocoding API that were quite interesting was drive time and traffic. So that added a whole new dimension of analysis, allowing the client to find out how long it was taking each person to arrive. So that was quite an exciting piece of work. So it's a great segue into APIs because there's a lot that what I'll be covering is the tip of the iceberg. So I'll go over what APIs are, and something I'm often asked is who is JSON? So I'll correct that right now by saying there is no JSON. It's actually JSON, which stands for JavaScript Object Notation. So I'll be going over that quite soon in this presentation. I'll then be going over two key pieces of software. So one of them being Postman and the other one being Alteryx. And then I'll be going over an example of using the API with Guardian, which is quite a big news company. So what are APIs? So to put simply, APIs are application programming interfaces, but what does that actually mean? So typically when people talk about APIs, they're talking about RESTful APIs, and the RESTful APIs are where you're able to it's a framework for being able to send information over the internet. So if you've already been exposed a bit to some data terms, you've got the CRUD functions: create, read, update, delete. So what the RESTful API does is effectively translate these into a way you can send them over the internet. So that's GET requests, POST requests, PUT requests, and delete requests. When you're browsing the internet, you're always sending a GET request. You're sending a GET request to get an HTML document. The browser will send that back to you. I'll go over that again shortly. Now, two things to highlight as well with APIs is typically they will need authentication. For even free APIs, you'll need to set up an account. That's simply to stop, to be able to prevent abuse and to be able to throttle the number of API requests, because every time a server receives an API request, it has to generate a response. And seeing as you can't disguise ads in API requests, they want to make money somehow. So they usually have a freemium type model. A lot of companies have a freemium type model. So you pay for, you can get a certain number of requests for free per day, but if you want more, you pay. That's not always the case, but sometimes it is the case. So that's always good to bear in mind. So just to give a bit of a high level overview of the internet, you have your computer, and your computer sends a HTTP request. Actually, let's go back a step. Your computer is going to request a website, so www. That goes to a server, and that server will respond with the HTML. The HTML looks nice on a web browser because the web browser makes it look nice. But what you're actually doing is sending a GET, and you're receiving HTML. Now, with APIs, it's not that different. What you're sending, what you're trying to find is what's called an endpoint. And this endpoint, which is more or less the same thing as this, is quite often also a GET request. Now, the difference here, it still goes from your computer to a server, is that instead of getting an HTML back that you can actually read, you get some JSON. So this JSON is data in a very specific format that you can use Alteryx. So JSON, so like I said at the start of this presentation, JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. So one of the big pros about this is it's flexible, robust, and it's used anywhere. You can have indentations, you can have no indentations. It won't matter to the computer. And it's used almost everywhere. Like virtually every API will have JSON, or at least have JSON as an object, especially RESTful APIs. The difficulty with JSON is it can have multi-dimensionals. So when it comes to turning this into a table form, which is what's used in SQL, Alteryx, even Excel, so that sort of structure, it can be a bit challenging to do that. But I'll go over some tricks towards the end with the example for doing that. And just to point out now, always pick JSON over XML. It's far more easier to parse and transform JSON, even though XML might look a bit like an Excel file, it's very different. So always go for JSON where you can. So what is JSON? So this is an example of myself and a colleague. He's quite a tall colleague, so I decided to keep the typo. And what we have here is an object. So the object here is myself, and the object here is my colleague. So these are two people in the people object. So what this means is it's an array. An array is a collection of objects. So don't think of this in table form. Try to think of this as a new structure. So inside the list of people, we have two people. Now, inside the list inside each person, we have a name, a height, and a job. We have a number here and we have a string here indicated by the quotation marks. The comma means that there's more than one. So the last one does not have a comma. Now, if I wanted to add another job, the first thing to do would be to turn it into jobs. So there's still one job per person, but now we have multiple jobs. So these squiggly lines are not in this layout. Like I said, indentations don't matter to JSON. All that matters is that you have the right brackets in the right order, but indentation makes it a lot more readable. So here we have our first item. So inside this object, we have one job. Inside this person, we have one job. Now, this is all well and great, but it does look a bit more complicated. So what's the advantage? Well, it's very easy to now add another job. So you might also notice here that we now have two identical jobs. That's not an issue. But from a data perspective, maybe we want some more fields for these jobs. To do that, we simply add another field. And like I said, indentations don't matter. This is identical to this. All I've done here is expand out the jobs. So you still have two people and you still have two jobs. Hopefully that gives you a bit of an overview about JSON structure, and I'll go through this in the example. So when it comes to actually setting up an API, I've condensed this into a 5-step process. Now you can use this 5-step process for any API, and I'll get to some more examples at the end. But for now, the first step is to find the endpoint. So the endpoint is essentially the URL. It's like that www dot. You want to find the endpoint. And associated with that, you also want to find documentation relating to that endpoint. The next step that you always want to do is send something basic. Now, on most documentation, you have an example. Sometimes you even have an example that you can use through the web browser. If you have that, send it, because getting the basic part of an API working is sometimes the hardest part. So once you're able to do something basic, you're able to build up from that. So the next thing you want to do is you want to build something specific. So basic to specific. Now for both of those steps, we want to be doing that in a tool called Postman. And I'll be going over that tool quite shortly. After you've got that working in Postman, that's when you move it to Alteryx, because getting it to work in Alteryx for the first time when you're dealing with an unfamiliar API can actually be quite challenging. If you get it working in Postman first, it's very easy. Once you have it working in Alteryx, that's when you transform the data. And by transforming the data, I mean converting into whatever shape you need for your analysis. And Alteryx is fantastic with doing that. So if I search Guardian API, sure enough, we have the Guardian API. Now, if I jump over to getting started, this was what I was talking about at the start. You have a free version of this API where you're able to do 12 calls per second, 5,000 calls per day. And then you have a commercial API, which costs money, but if you're creating a website or something like that, this can be quite powerful. And again, a lot of APIs follow this sort of business model. So let's create an API. The first thing that you want to do is you want to get a developer key. So on the Guardian, we click here and we fill out this form. Because I've already done this, I'm going to skip ahead. So this was the email I got after registering for the API key. Now, not all APIs do this, but Guardian did, which is fantastic. They actually sent me a link to an API so that in one click, I can actually see the API in work. Now, this might look like something's gone horribly wrong with my internet browser, but this is actually a JSON result. This is what you want to be seeing whenever you query the API. So what I'm actually seeing here is the current news. So if we have a quick look around here, we can see business written here. We can see some web publication date, and then we see Lloyd's beats forecast with near £2 billion profit. So what I want to do here is I want to go straight into Postman. How do I get to Postman? If you know how to install software, fantastic. Google Postman, click here, go product, API client, because that's what you always do. You always want to download the client, and you download the client. Now, you don't need to create a user account, but if you want to create a user account, go for it. But what you want to be doing is downloading this API client. I'm not going to show you how to install software. That's pretty straightforward to be able to do. So this is Postman. Now, when you open up Postman, you might get asked to log in. You can actually just skip right past that and get straight into this workspace. Now, there's a plus icon up here. When you click this plus icon, you suddenly have a GET request. Now, all I've done is copied that URL, and I'm going to paste that URL here. So you can already see that the API key has been populated with my key in the value area. If I click send, it's going to send a request to this API, and I'm going to see the exact same result that I saw before, but now it's in JSON format. Now, because, like I said, this is live news, we've actually already got more up-to-date news than that. It's a coronavirus update in India that has already beaten the Lloyd's update. So this API is very live and it's very current. Now, I might be interested in delving into that world news, into the world news about COVID. How do I do that with the API? Well, that's a decision that the Guardian makes when they choose what features are available for an API. So if I go back to the website and I jump over to documentation, this is where I'm able to see everything. Now, just by scrolling down, I'm able to see content endpoint / search. If we have a look at Postman again, we can see that sure enough, over here, it says search. So this is the endpoint component. This little slash here, / search, that's the endpoint. So when we go to our documentation about this, what we want to be doing is we want to be reading about this search endpoint. We'll go straight down to a section called parameters. So every API documentation has this. It shows you what the parameters are and what you need to send it as. So the first thing is API key. We've already seen that in action. But let's have a look at this, Q. What Q seems to do is it seems to accept values that allow you to query your results, similar to the search bar on the main news site. So if I go back here and I just type Q here and COVID here, I'm actually going to be able to see, presumably, all the COVID responses. And sure enough, I do. I'm seeing a COVID article here, a COVID article there, COVID article everywhere. Now, I might not be interested in some of these other articles. For example, this is an article about music. This is an article about business. Let's just say that I'm only interested in world news articles on COVID. How would I do that? Well, now, if I go back to this API and go and look around a bit, we can see that there's a section here called section football. Now, if we have a look at the results, we have over here, section ID world. So I'm gonna just type in section world and see what happens. We've got world, we've got world, we've got world. Suddenly we don't have any of these other articles. We're only returning world results. Now, we're also only getting 10 results per page. I might want more results than that. So let's have a look back on this guide, and sure enough, we have page size. So if I go back here, I can now increase the API to having 50 results on this page. Right, so now comes the fun part of getting this loaded into Alteryx. Now, if I want to customize this, what I would do is turn each of these into a parameter, but for the purposes of just getting this moving and making this easy to understand, I'm going to just copy the entire URL, go into Alteryx, use a text input tool. So this lets you manually enter information, type full URL. Now this can be named anything that you want. And I've just copied and pasted the entire thing into Alteryx. Now, the tool that we want to use for this purpose is the download tool. Now, the download tool is also an upload tool. All it does is it will send a request, and you can change the nature of the request here. So you've got your get, put, post, delete options. You can even have a custom option, which some rare APIs might use. But in general, for just a normal GET request, all we need to do here is select the URL from the dropdown. In this case, we've just got the full URL and hit run. Now, to test if it's working, we want to see this say 200. If it says any other number, there's something wrong. Now, over here, we've got what looks like it could be a problem, but if you remember what it looked like in the browser before, this is actually just the same as this. It's the JSON and collapsed form. So what we now want to do is we want to expand out the JSON. How do we do that? There's actually a tool called JSON Parse, and JSON Parse makes this extremely easy. Now, whenever we're working with APIs, this won't be an issue for this tool, but it is usually good practice to cache and run the workflow. That way you're not creating an API call every time you run the workflow. Some APIs take a long time, some cost money, some have usage limits. So it's usually good to cache and run the workflow. So that was just by right-clicking. Now, when I use this, nothing happens. That's because I've got the full URL selected. Always make sure that download data is what's selected here. So the download data was the JSON. And sure enough, once we expand this out, we now have a lot of rows. And if we go down this list, we go down to 49. That's because it started counting from 0. So this is exactly what we want to do. Now, because everything's in this annoying format, it's not really in tabular format, the next thing that we want to do is text to columns. Very useful tool when working with APIs. We want to change this into a full stop, and we want to change this to JSON name. So if we go into the look at the input view just by selecting here, we're able to see JSON name looks like this. So currently we have 1, 2, 3, 4, but in truth, it doesn't really matter what number you click when you're developing a workflow, but it's usually good to keep it down to the minimum. So if I now look at what the output looks like, all I've done is split this out based on the periods. Now to minimize how far I've gone, I can see nothing's going past number 5. So all I need here is the number 4. Rerun the workflow, and sure enough, I have this. Now, you'll notice all of these heading responses that we don't really want don't have a number in JSON name 3. How do we get rid of those? You guessed it, the filter tool. So I'll put down a filter tool if name 3 is null, or rather is not null. When I run this, I get all of the items. Now, the next thing to do is use a tool up here called crosstab. Now, crosstab's a very powerful tool when working with APIs. You practically always go through this process in Alteryx of download, text to column, filter, and then crosstab. So what I want to do is I want to group all the numbers by this column here, because each one represents a single record. So we've got JSON name 3 as the group by column. The column headers I want to be these things, these JSON names 4. So I'm going to change that to JSON name 4. Now the values I want to be this value string over here, because that's what the values for each item are. Now you always have to click something here. So I normally click concatenate so there's no risk of me losing information. I'm just going to hit run. Sure enough, if I click output, we've now transformed the data. We've got this JSON name 1 going all the way to 50. It's not in order because it's currently a string. And we have the web URL, we've got the web title, we've got all the information that we had before. Thanks very much for watching. So just to recap everything that we've gone over, to set up an API, the first thing you want to do is find the endpoint and the documentation, get your account set up, all of the basic stuff there. Then you want to send something basic. So that's the example that you find in the API documentation, something really easy. And then you want to grow that into the specific API call you want to make. So first you get it working, then you send something a bit more complicated. Once you've done that, and you can do it in Postman, which is a free tool, you move it into Alteryx, and then from Alteryx, you transform the data. Now, the process that we went over in Alteryx was you use the download tool to download the data. You use the JSON tool to turn that JSON to something Alteryx can use. You use the text to columns tool to expand that data out. You use a filter tool, and then you use a crosstab tool. Thanks very much for your attention, and look forward to talking to you all in questions and answers.